Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chris Friel, G4AUF, Chairman of the Radio Society of Harrow, and I'd like to welcome you along this evening to our YouTube presentation. Just a couple of logistics. You can ask questions at any time, just type them in the chat box, and you can also send them by email to webmaster@g3efx.org.uk. And at the end, questions will be asked to the speaker, and hopefully you'll get the answers that you are looking for. So our presentation this evening is by Carl, M0ICR, and he's going to talk on a beginner's guide to DXing and contesting on VHF and above. So over to you, Carl.
Hello everyone, good evening. Just checking that everything's ready to go. I didn't hear a word that Chris said due to the way it's set up, so Chris could have said anything about me at all and I'd have no idea, but I'm sure it was all good stuff. Very good evening, and delighted to be talking to Radio Society of Harrow this evening. As a member of Radio Society of Harrow, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you again. It's been a while since I've done a talk to the group, and a real privilege for me tonight to do two things that I'm really quite passionate about. The first is VHF DXing and contesting, of course, and the second is it's a treat just to pass on some of that information and hopefully enthuse you to look at some of the areas that I discussed this evening. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Nobody's come from the chat and said that they hadn't, so hopefully that's all okay. I'm going to be covering quite a lot of ground tonight, so just a couple of pointers for you. First of all, I'll show you in a second where you can find this presentation. Of course, you'll always be able to watch it again on YouTube, but if you want to, thanks Chris, as if you would, but if you want to actually download the whole PowerPoint presentation and go through in your own time, you'll be able to do that. And there'll be a number of links in this presentation as well. So if you want to dig a bit deeper into some of the topics that I cover, you'll be able to do that through the links. Thank you for the introduction, Chris. I'm Carl Ratcliffe. As I said, I'm a member of Radio Society of Harrow. I'm also the club secretary for the Drowned Rats radio group, and more on the Drowned Rats later as we progress through this presentation. I suppose the first thing I really wanted to say is about the title of this presentation. It is a beginner's guide, not the beginner's guide, and that's important because there are many ways to get interested in this topic this evening. Phasing audio, fading in and out a little. Okay, Hamza, I'll try and speak up and hopefully Kirk can do something to equalize that, but I'll keep going. If it gets worse, then let me know and we'll try and sort out the technical side. So as I said, it's a beginner's guide to VHF DXing and contesting. In truth, it's probably a 4-hour presentation. Don't worry, I won't speak for 4 hours. Those that know me well know that I could easily, but I'll cover it in a reasonable time and allow plenty of time at the end for questions. And without being cliched, you know, there are no such thing as silly questions, so please ask away, and I'll try and help out. I'm pleased to see so many old friends on here on the chat already with some banter, and I know that a couple of Drowned Rats have joined us as well, and they're here for a bit of moral support, but also to help me out if you ask any really tricky questions that I struggle with. So hopefully you've enjoyed looking at that eye candy slide as I've been speaking, and we'll return some of these photographs later in the evening. This presentation, by the way, I've put together especially for Radio Society of Harrow, and it was a great pleasure doing that, but this has been tailored for you all this evening, so it's specific to you as a group. Some photographs as eye candy, and just at the bottom a couple of links. There's my email address if you want to contact me. That's my Drowned Rats email address, and then below that there's my personal blog, a little bit more on that later, my personal email address, and then at the bottom in the slide template you can see the URL for our group, the Drowned Rats. So let's carry on then and move on to the second slide. And I think I've failed already. There we go. That link that I mentioned before, my blog, is at www.m0ICR.com. You'll see the web address there on the right-hand side of the screen. And for quite a lot of what I talk about tonight, I'll give you links. So if you go back to the PowerPoint version, you'll be able to click on those links and perhaps find out a little bit more. If you go to my blog, the big red arrow there at the top indicates where you'll find a link to download this presentation, but also a lot more information about VHF contesting. And I'd be delighted if whilst you were there, you had a little look around the blog as well. So let's move on then. What am I going to cover tonight? I'm really going to talk about four things. The first thing is getting started, and I'll talk about why you might be interested, why bother at all. I'll talk about radios and antennas, and I'll talk about location. I'll talk a little bit about logging, and that's sort of general thing, which that section really applies to whether you're interested in the contesting side of VHF or you're more interested in VHF DXing outside contesting. And then if you'll humour me, I'll talk for a few minutes about the drowned rats, what we are. And if you manage to stay to the bitter end, then I promise to make that worth your while with an interesting proposal for you. I noticed there's a small lag in between the slides appearing on your screen and on mine, so I'll try and track that and make sure that what you can see is what I see. So I said we'd talk about getting started first, but before doing that, just a quick history lesson, because and I know that some members of the group will be well aware, some might not be, that Harrow has a long and distinguished history in contesting, both on VHF and HF. The picture on the left, I think, is up at Brill, but certainly is taken in the mid-60s and is from the Radio Society of Harrow website. There is an archive, by the way, of some really excellent photographs back in the day that show Peter Marcham and show Dave John, WCB, and Chris. And many others, some now sadly long since gone silent key. But I just wanted to reinforce that the idea of contesting and Harrow is certainly nothing new. On the right-hand side of that slide, there's a photograph there of a couple of more recent members. And this photograph's about 5 years old now, and that was tinkering up at Old Reading. I can certainly see Mike there, ITI, and I think that's my military mast, Klansman mast, and I think that's Dave CAG's 9-element tonner for 2 meters. So let me just get rid of that. I don't know why that's appeared, my VPN, and let's move on. So why would you want to get interested in VHF and in DXing and contesting? Well, it's fun. It really is. And there's a great community around VHF. It's not a very large community, but it's small enough in the UK that many people know each other, all extremely friendly and willing to help newcomers. And in many ways that relates to, I think, my fourth bullet that I'll come to in a second. But getting involved in VHF DXing and VHF contesting is a real opportunity to learn more about radio, and whether it's about operating, whether it's about engineering a station, or it's about propagation, and so much more, or indeed all of that together. It's a real opportunity to expand your knowledge and fun that you can gain out of radio. And I know that there are many who are turned off by the idea of contesting because their experience has been HF, and their experience has been sometimes what can be some inapproachable people, and sometimes quite a surly group, sometimes difficult to penetrate into the HF contesting community. And it's difficult to do well because there are so many big stations out there, and so many, particularly when you look at the global stage, really, really powerful stations. VHF contesting tends to be friendly, with people always willing to help out and extremely well welcoming of beginners. The contests tend to be shorter, and of course, for many of us with busy lives who can't commit to long HF contests over 48 hours, then there's a real attraction in VHF contesting in something that's shorter. And in many ways, whilst it's hard in anything to be at the top, then I'd say that the entry level can be so much easier. It's easy to compete, easier to compete mid-table in contests. But I think more generally, just talking about VHF and DXing for a while, of course, the other attraction is that in this period of sunspot minimum, when the HF bands are not in great shape, and when most QSOs these days are on FT8, that's just not attractive to some. Actually, I quite enjoy digital modes on HF, but I can see how it's not attractive to some. And so in order to get use out of that expensive radio equipment that you've invested in to keep your radio interest going, then VHF and above is a real opportunity to do that whilst we're in a VHF contest, an HF minimum in terms of conditions. And there's a photograph on the right of Radio Society of Harrow member and also Drowned Rats member Gene M0ICR out on one of our contests. So moving on, and there is a lag, so I'll just let the slides catch up. And in many ways, this slide, once it appears on your screens, crikey, there is a lag. Just stand by whilst we catch up. I'm not sure the slides. Oh, there we go. Right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. And in many ways, this is the most important slide. If you take one thing away from this talk this evening, what I really want you to do is to have a think about both of these topics. And the first is what makes a great station, what makes a competitive station, what makes an effective station. And in many ways, this is the same for HF, but there are some subtleties in VHF, and we'll talk about those in some detail. Now, I've listed what I think are the 6 elements that make a great amateur radio station. And they're not in any particular order, although I think everybody will probably recognize that even if you've bought the very latest equipment, but you have no operator skill, and you don't know how to use that radio and how to get the most out of its features, then you're probably on a hiding to nothing. And similarly, you can be very experienced, have some great equipment, be using the maximum power that you can with low feed line coax and a great antenna, but conditions are just playing against you. And I'm afraid that's just something that sometimes, even on VHF and above, is something that we just have to live with. But of course, when conditions are poor, they're poor for everybody, for the most part. And so we have something of a so I'm just reading the chat. It's not the slide delay, it's the voice delay. Okay. And so I think those factors are all important, and we'll talk about all 6 of them as we go through this presentation. And it's I think an ongoing controversial point about what order you might put those. But what I would say is that in some of those, if you are weak or over-invest, then you may be disappointed. And power is probably the most interesting, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because I think for many people there is there's a sense that to do better they just need to use more power, and in many cases that isn't the answer, and I'll explain why in a second. But in really simple terms, what I'm actually saying is that you don't want to be what we would call an alligator, big mouth and small ears, because it's a cliche, and many will have heard it before. But if you can't hear them, you can't work them. And so even if you've got the latest and highest power amplifier, good evening, Phil, nice to see you here. You've got the highest power amplifier that you're allowed. Then if you can't hear the other station, then you're actually on a hiding to nothing and you won't get a QSO. And in many cases, I would argue that the route to improving the overall balance of a station is on the antenna and the feed line. And so that really moves me on nicely onto what's on the right hand side of the slide. And I've used this phrase, DXing is a game of decibels. And that's a phrase that I've stolen from a very prolific and experienced contester called Ian White. Some of you may know as G3SEK. He's moved to Scotland. He's now GM3SEK. Very prolific on VHF. Normally does a talk at the VHF convention, and the author of what is still one of the VHF Bibles, VHF DXing guide. And what we're really talking about here is understanding the decibel. The decibel is the unit of gain or loss, and how to get a ideally balanced station. What we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the amount of loss in our station and maximize the amount of gain. Now, some of the loss in the station, which reduces the strength of signals, will come from factors which are difficult to deal with, factors that are to do with atmospheric loss due to conditions, or those natural losses in your signal, as over time it attenuates with distance. Some of the issues with noise and with weak signals, though, are to do with local noise, and they're to do with, for example, some things that you may be able to deal with locally, like LED lighting or a plasma television. And I know that HF bands, in particularly some of the lower bands, are particularly rife with this, and VDSL is a particular problem for many on HF. But issues like LED lighting, for example, can be a real issue for people on VHF. And one of the things I would say is that if you're one of the first things to do if you're trying to optimize your receive station, but you seem to be getting a high noise level, is to start switching a few things off in your local, in your house, and just see if that's the culprit. And there are things that you can then do to filter those things, for example, to try and help you deal with low signals. I said earlier, and I'm moving on to sort of the first bullet in this list now, that antenna gain works for transmit and receive. And I think this is really important because whilst you can buy a 100-watt amplifier, which will increase your transmitted signal from 10 watts to 100 watts, a 10 decibel gain amplifier, 10 watts in and 100 watts out, it does nothing to help your ability to hear the other station at the other end. So if you couldn't hear him with 10 watts, you still can't hear him when you're transmitting 100 watts. But if you introduce into that an antenna that has directional gain, and we'll talk much more about this later, that has a 10 decibel gain in the antenna, then not only is the effect of increasing the effective radiated power of your 10 watts to 100 watts, but the signal that you're receiving is also 10 times louder, 10 decibels louder. So my first piece of advice really is about working on the antenna, reducing losses in the coax, because of course the cheaper the coax and the longer the coax, the less good quality the coax, and the longer the coax, that will lose signal. So we use good quality coax, and we keep the coax as short as we can, and we try and get some gain in our antenna, which helps both receive and transmit. Because, as it says in the second bullet, increasing your output power only works in one direction. I've already spoken about reducing losses and maximizing the gain. And the things that you might do to reduce that noise. For example, switching off some LED lights in the house could be really helpful. And the fourth thing, it may sound obvious, but I think there's an awful lot in this about learning to hear better. There's no doubt that when you're DXing, you're often working stations at the margin of what you can hear. And there's a skill that comes with time and experience. And for many, of course, in the past who were shortwave listeners, they came into the hobby, the transmitting side of the hobby, after many years listening to DX with a shortwave receiver or similar. But I think it is worth practicing listening to weak signals. And it's remarkable sometimes when you can put two people in the same room, and we've done this when we've been out as a contesting group, listening to the same radio, and one person's ear is just slightly better tuned to that, because in many ways, the human ear is far more effective than any amount of filtering and DSP and all of those whiz bangs that modern radios provide. And the fifth thing is learn to use your radio, because particularly if you're using a more modern radio, but even on some of the oldies and goldies, and we'll talk about some of these radios in a second, there are many people who don't know and have never actually read the manual and haven't practiced with what all the features do on their radio. People who never use their attenuator, don't know how to use the RF gain, have always got the preamps on, know that the radio has DSP filtering, but have never actually worked out how to use it. Or on transmit, set their audio compression too high, which gives the effect on their transmitted signal meter that they're always bending the needle to the right, but actually maybe causing severe distortion at the other end. So my final point on this slide is read your radio's manual, and get the most out of it. And of course, you can do that anytime. You don't have to be in a contest, but just in general listening, you can start to listen to some weak stations and work out whether you need the attenuator on or off. And if it's a loud station, particularly if you've got, excuse me, in a busy contest, many stations all in a small amount of bandwidth, then a loud station that may be splattering and causing you some problems if you're quite close to them in frequency, simply by switching your attenuator on may improve things no end. Similarly, having the RF gain too high can cause problems and start overload in your radio. I'm not going to go into some of the technical details on those, but we can talk about perhaps some of those features in questions later. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to assume that you can see it as soon as I can now. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what kind of radios you might be able to use to get started in this this hobby of VHF DXing and VHF contesting. And for many, you already have that radio. You may have one of the radios on this screen. You may have a 991 or an FT857 or something like that. But many of the black boxes that have been available now for the last 20 years provide DC to daylight, as to say, but certainly top band up to 70 centimeters. I had an 857 for many years. I had one when they first came out. And at the time, I wasn't really interested in VHF DXing, but it was reassuring to know that when I started to get interested, that I already had a piece of equipment that could do that. But I never switched 2 meters onto upper sideband before, because I'd never thought to. But there was a whole world of radio sitting inside that radio that I already had. So I suppose the point that I'm making is that many of us have these multi-band radios, and whilst if you are striving for the very, very best, these are not quite the cream of the crop for top-level contesting or DXing. They'll get you well into the hobby and are all, with some compromises, all very effective radios to start dipping your toe into the subject I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail as we move along. Of course, many will have invested in the ICOM 9700. That's a great radio for VHF DXing and contesting. Again, there are better and there are some minor issues, but nothing that we need to concern with in a presentation at this level. But of course, the sister radio to the ICOM 7300, which comes equipped with 2 meters, 70 centimeters, and 23 centimeters, and a very nice radio. And I know a number of people who've joined us on this call use that radio, and it's well equipped. It has that lovely pan adapter scope to see signals within the selected span of the pan adapter. It has great DSP features and much more, which some of the features of which we'll talk about in a little second. But you don't need one of those modern radios, and in many ways, some of the best radios are still some of these types of radios built 20 or 30 years ago. And radios like the ICOM 275 on 2 meters and the Yaesu FT225 are still very highly regarded radios amongst DXers and contesters on 2 meters, and they have similar models within the range that work on 70 centimeters and other bands as well. But these are great radios and can be picked up for relatively little money if you don't have one. But many people will have these, and these are the kind of radios that often appear at rallies and at silent key sales and so on. And if they've been looked after, can be really excellent performers. And one of the reasons for that is that they are single band, and because they're single band radios, then they've been optimized for that band. And many of the features that come out of the kind of radios which have to be compromisers, like those that I mentioned earlier, are engineered out by being able to focus on these single bands. So this kind of radio can be a really excellent start. Of course, only one band, doesn't come with some of the features like a pan adapter that some of the modern radios have, but can be very, very popular. And radios like this can be picked up, those on the left hand side, for say £300, and sometimes much less if you can be lucky. And I just put up a picture of the lovely old FT290, still quite a popular radio, low power, but a pretty good performer actually, and a number of people use them for driving transverters. I'll talk a little bit about transverters later, particularly if it has the Mutec front end, a modification adapter board that improves some of the specifications of that radio. I said I'd talk a little bit about transverters. I'm not going to talk in a great deal about transverters, but what a transverter allows you to do is to use an HF radio, and by connecting the transverter in line between the radio and the antenna, then it will allow you to operate on one of the VHF or UHF bands. Generally, some transverters do other things, but the transverters that I'm picturing here, what they're all designed to do is to take an HF transceiver and get you onto a VHF and UHF band. So if you're listening to this and the only VHF and UHF radio that you have is a FM, then in order to get involved in DXing and contesting, you're going to want to, for the most part, want to have upper sideband. There are opportunities to do DXing with CW and digital modes. But if you don't have a radio that has upper sideband, then one route into it is the transverter route. And the transverters that I'm showing on the left-hand side, that's a microwave modules transverter from the 80s. Can be picked up at a rally for about £30, often much less. And that one that I'm picturing there will allow a radio on 10 meters, 28 megahertz, to operate on 2 meters and about 8 watts output, and then of course can be connected to an amplifier. Of course, it's 80s technology, not fantastic, but certainly not a bad way to get started. And on a number of bands, that's how I got started, by cheap and cheerful microwave modules, transverters, and I think at least one of those I picked up at a Harrow surplus sale. These circuit boards in the middle are one of a range of Ukrainian transverters, which come as PCBs. Actually, there are also boxed versions of them. They go for about £30. The top circuit board is a transverter. I think that one's for 2 meters, and below is an attenuator board, just so that the transmit power into the transverter is lowered, and that you don't damage the input circuitry on the transverter. And it doesn't take an awful lot of interconnecting wires. They come with the instructions to get up and running. And as long as you don't run them at their full power, as long as you turn the power down a little bit on those, again, they can be a good start. Interestingly, they're available for 4 meters, and for many people that don't have 4 meters, 70 megahertz on their radios, and many of those that I showed earlier, even as modern radios do not, then the transverter route, whether it's a microwave modules or even one of these Ukrainian transverter sets, can be a useful start. I suppose the final piece of advice I'd give you on the transverter front, on that Ukrainian transverter, is that many seasoned contesters would raise an eyebrow. And I'd say you're probably okay if you don't run them into an amplifier. But if you're getting started with a low gain antenna, just to tip your toe, then you should be fine with one of those little Ukrainian transverters as a start if you don't have VHF and UHF into your radio. On the right hand of the scale, here's an example of a top-end transverter, this one by DB6NT, the Kuna range of transverters. This is a 70 centimeters transverter that allows you to operate with HF input. That one again is for a 28 megahertz radio and allows you to listen and transmit on 70 centimeters. About £400, but that is the Rolls Royce and right at the top end, one of the best solutions for VHF UHF contesting. A very well designed piece of equipment, but you don't need to start with that. Certainly, it's the kind of thing that many contesters, top contesters, would use, and it's the kind of thing that we use within the Drowned Rats, but you certainly don't need to start at that point. So having covered a little bit on transverters, I do want to talk and slightly longer about antennas. And remember that when I spoke about some of those top tips in that earlier slide, I said that an antenna is a really important part of the system to get you involved and effective in VHF DXing and contesting. Oh, sorry, before I do that, I've realized there's one more slide I wanted to show on radios. Now, this is an example of what can be achieved if you're a tinkerer, if you want to build your own station, then actually there's real scope in VHF and UHF and above into SHF and the gigahertz for experimenting with Raspberry Pis, with things like the Hack RF, the Pluto, and other SDR equipment. And this, in the top left-hand corner, is that jumble of wires is a collection of boxes that Drowned Rats member Gordon G3WJG put together, and with some open source software and a little bit of Python coding, that is now an HF to gigahertz transceiver system. And the photograph below that shows a small amplifier, originally I think designed for cellular use, and that gives him 5 watts output, which could be fed into a bigger amplifier then for a relatively small outlay, and some real technical exploration in doing that, and some real innovation. And in fact, that image, although I think the final version looks a bit neater and not so many trailing wires, is now I believe has just won an RSGB constructors competition. And what the image on the right hand side shows is Gordon's operating screen, and at the top right hand side, that's how it looks to Gordon in terms of the frequency. He's on 432.140 decimal 300, so he's on 70 centimeters, and you can see a signal that he's receiving on that spectrum display. And then beneath that, there's a little bit of code that he wrote in Python to control the transmit and receive. And then some screens on the other side that are to do with the actual contest and the logging program that he's using. So if you're a real tinkerer and you want to play around with things like Arduino and things like Raspberry Pi, then there's certainly a route there for you in VHF and above DXing and contesting. Okay, so antennas. I'm going to talk a while about antennas now. And the first thing I just wanted to mention is polarization. So most VHF and above contesting and DXing will be using horizontally polarized antennas. So rather than vertical antennas, which will tend to be vertically polarized, we use horizontal polarization generally, where the transmission is orientated in a horizontal position, and if the receiving station is also receiving those radio waves in horizontal polarization, then you get the maximum benefit of the transmit and the receive signal in the game. But if one station is transmitting in horizontal polarization and another receiving in a vertical polarization, then whilst you may be able to hear each other, there'll be significant loss in that signal. And whilst there are different figures, it's generally accepted to be between a 20 and 30 decibel difference in transmitting on the same polarization. So remember, if you remember from your amateur radio mathematics, that a 20 decibel difference in signal is 100 times weaker, or 100 times stronger if you are aligning the polarization. So whilst you can operate and do VHF contesting and DXing with vertical polarization, with a few exceptions that I'll mention later, you are for the most part disadvantaging yourself. And my first piece of advice really is look for a horizontally polarized antenna, and we'll talk more about what that means in a second. The first of those two photographs, incidentally, the one on the left hand side next to a chimney pot, shows a typical vertical VHF antenna, the sort of thing that you might buy from Comet or Diamond, which I think that's called a W30, or it could be a W50. Dual band, there are tri-band versions of those, and they're great for working repeaters, and you can get a fair distance with them on FM. But if you're trying to work stations that are horizontally polarized, as I said, you are disadvantaging yourself. Most amateurs who are doing DXing and contesting will be using beams, Yagi beams, and an example of a simple Yagi beam is the photograph on the right hand side, and I think that's from a company called but I'm not sure where that one's from. That might be a power beam, but you can see that it has a boom, which is the long square section piece, and then a number of elements which are all approximately half a wavelength. Actually, in most designs, then moving left to right, the very back element is the reflector. The one in this image that's shown in brown is the driven element, and then in front of that there are directors, and that works like a torch beam. In the same way as a torch, those elements bring the signal that you're transmitting into a sharper focus, and much more on this later, and increase the intensity of that power in a given direction, and reduce the intensity of the power and reception in a direction that it's not pointing. And I'm going to talk about that in much more detail. Generally, most of those types of beams will be for a single band, but there are examples out there of dual banders or even tri-banders, where multiple bands can be worked from a single boom. It just has elements for different bands engineered onto that boom, but typically we'll be using a single band Yagi type of beam, and as I said, much more on those later. There are some novel designs out there as well, all with their advantages and disadvantages. You may have come across a Harrow, an omnidirectional antenna. Doesn't have direction in any one direction, but that is a horizontally polarized antenna. Or an HB9CV, a quite small and compact version of a beam. Moxons, big wheels, slim gins, and so much more. And incidentally, the picture of that vertical antenna, if you wondered what that clover leaf thing was underneath it, then that's a big wheel. I believe that Peter has one of these. Good evening, Jules. Nice to see you here. Just seen you in the chat channel. And that antenna is a big wheel, and in effect works in a very similar way to a 3-element beam, but rather than those elements being pointed in one direction and therefore directional, it provides all-round coverage in that sort of circular shape created by those 3 leaves. And one of the advantages of that kind of antenna is that it doesn't need to be moved. You don't need to turn it in different directions. You don't need to move it left and right, because that antenna is transmitting equally and receiving equally in all directions. And I've just seen the question there from Don. Yeah, that's a big wheel, Don. I think that's a big wheel from Wimo antennas, and I know Peter has one of those, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about his experiences with it. But they can be a really good beginner's antenna because they don't require to be moved or rotated in different directions to pick up signals. But anything is better than nothing, even if it's a simple dipole. Then my advice is to get onto the air. I did say I was going to talk quite a bit more about antennas, so stay with me. So here's that antenna that I mentioned before, and that is a 6-element Yagi, as I mentioned. Yagi comes from the Japanese designer of beam antennas. Don't ask me for the full Japanese name. And that one, as I said, has 6 elements. On the right-hand side, although not for this particular antenna, but it's good enough for the purposes of this presentation, then this is a Smith chart, and this is quite useful to understand. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this in a second. So what we can see on this antenna, on this chart, is a series of concentric circles. And those concentric circles illustrate 2 things. The first is power or gain, and you'll see that the outer ring is a relative of 0 dB, and then increased levels or decreased levels, whether you're starting outside in or from the center of power. All this will become clear in a second. Now, if you look at that diagram, the blue balloon indicates where the maximum amount of power will come out of that antenna. So if it is pointing in the direction of the green line, then the antenna will be radiating most efficiently in the direction that's bound by that sort of blue balloon, and with most of the power going in the direction of the green line. And what you can see, if that's a 360-degree circle, that there's a width there actually of around 60 degrees, but that the maximum intensity within that blue balloon is about 45 degrees. So that antenna would be said to have a 45-degree beam width, and we'll come on to this in much more detail in a second. If you look at the figures below that, you'll see that this is quoted as an antenna of having 11.86 dBi of gain. So 11.86 decibels, and that's related isotropic decibels. So for those that this is revision, you'll remember that a dipole has 2.1 dBi. So to look at this relative to a dipole, we would use dBd. So we would say that this antenna is something in the order of about 9.7 decibels gain, which for all intents and purposes is 10 decibels. So in terms of effective radiated power, if you put 10 watts into this antenna, then you will have an effective radiated power out of that antenna, assuming no losses in your coax, of 100 watts, the 10 decibels gain that gives you. But the 10 decibels gain will also ensure that stations that you're listening in the direction that you're pointing, and particularly within that beam width shown by the pink lines, which is your 45, which is the beam width, that within that beam width, then you will have a much better chance of hearing a station. And we'll come on to a little bit more of this in a second. You'll also see just behind that big blue bubble, there are some much smaller blue bubbles as well. And what that really shows is that depending on the design of this antenna, that you'll also be radiating some power behind it and some power to the sides as well. And that power to the sides is what we call side lobes, and what's at the back, and the relative amount of what's coming off the back of the antenna and off the front is known as the front to back ratio. Now, of course, there's a real benefit in this, because if I'm directing all of my energy in one direction, not only does it mean that there's more chance that energy is going to reach the other station that I'm trying to contact. But it also means that I'm gathering up more of his energy in that given direction, but I'm not receiving interference and noise from the bits that are not within the blue area. So there are three benefits. Benefits in the intensity of my signal that's being transmitted, my ability to hear other people, but also my ability not to hear people that I don't want to. So let's look at what that actually means then. Here's an example then of a 2 meter 6 element beam, and I'm beaming it from somewhere in IO 92. We'll come on to locator squares later, but for the sake of now, just look at the red triangle. That's my transmitting location. And all I've done with some pretty poor PowerPoint drawing is shown a representation. It's not quite the right shape, but it's good enough for this presentation of what typically 10 watts into that station might do into a 10 decibel gain antenna, and that big green lozenge is where the majority of that power is going and what I can hear. Now, the blue numbers that I've used around that indicate other stations. So let's look at what this means. Well, it means that if I point that antenna in the direction of the blue line, then I can certainly have a pretty good chance of working the station at position 2, at position 4, position 1, just about, but it would probably be better if I moved the antenna more in his direction, but I can probably just about hear him. And similarly, the station at location 3, but it would probably be better if I moved my antenna, in that case, a little bit closer in bearing towards that station antenna 3. So what have we got? We've got a station there in position 1. I think that's somewhere near Hull. We've got a station in position 4 that looks like it's somewhere around Carlisle. And then station 3, where's he? He's probably somewhere around Manchester. And I can probably work them. Now, I can't work the station at location 9, somewhere up in Scotland, because my beam width and my power, the gain, amount of gain that I'm putting in his direction, means that he's currently out of range, generally. Similarly, I'm going to struggle to work the station at position 6, which is probably somewhere near Bristol, station 7 out there towards Ipswich, and station 8 somewhere in northern France. So what I really want to be able to do, and I can probably work the station in 5, because you remember I had that little balloon at the back as well behind my antenna. So that's me beaming at 340 degrees, like it says in the top right hand corner of the screen. Now look what happens if I introduce a much longer antenna. This is a 12 element beam, but look at the difference. The previous antenna was 2 meters long. This is now 7 meters long. This is quite a monster. In fact, it's so long that you see it has to have supporting wires to make sure that it doesn't droop. But this has considerably more gain. But the disadvantage is that in having more gain, it has a narrower bandwidth. And so the lozenge now looks more like that yellow. And what does that mean? Well, it means that I now may be able to reach station at location 9 in Scotland. But station 1 now, I can't work. I'm going to have a much tighter beam width, and I'm going to have to start rotating at that antenna. I'm going backwards. And so, of course, as you can see, if I've got a rotator, and if you look at the top right-hand corner, you can see I've moved to 315 degrees, and now I'm pointing slap on the station at location 3, and I can work him. And then by using my rotator, I can keep moving round, and there we are. I'm now pointing at 250 degrees towards the station at position 6, and I can move it further to 130 degrees and round again to 80 to work the station near Ipswich. 10 degrees to at that station somewhere near Hull. And so what I'm illustrating there is how a beam not only helps you be able to direct your energy, in this case around the country as I'm trying to work at different stations, but it also allows me to not hear stations I don't want to that might interfere with the reception as well. Let's just look at some other examples of antennas then that you might want to try for VHF DXing and contesting. So the picture on the left shows two power beam antennas. The one at the top is a 70 centimeter antenna. The one below it is a 2 meter antenna. You can see that they're both on the same pole there, on the same mast. And they're both about 3 meters long, and they're two pretty good intermediate level antennas. Would typically cost you to buy about £120 each. But there are other things you can do, and on the right hand side there, that's what's called a 2-element quad. And that antenna can be quite effective, very compact for 2 meters. It does have some directional gain. Certainly wouldn't be generally as effective as one of the antennas on the left, but certainly nevertheless a good antenna and a good one to start with. Here are just a couple of other pictures then of the sort of antennas that you might see people using. The one on the left hand side is GALZE. That's an old J-beam. Some of you may recognize that's an 8-element J-beam. Again, that's a quad. The picture in the middle is Matt Twoelement SFI, and that's his 70 centimeter antenna that's mounted at the side of the house. And then I think the picture on the right is Damien's, and I think that's Damien on 23 centimeter with a mast strapped to his gazebo. So here are some examples of the sort of thing that you might see in a typical suburban environment. On the middle picture and the picture on the right, and the one on the left, what you might experience in the middle of a field, but all fairly small antennas, and the sort of thing that you can get away with putting up with relatively little trouble. And they of course can be telescopic, so that they can be lowered when you're not using them. I spoke about that power beam, and there's a link to that and to their website if you want to have a look at the sort of thing that they do. But there's an example of the 2 meter one, which is the antenna at the bottom of that stack on the left hand side. Or you can start off with something like that small Yagi on the right hand side. You can typically get those for about £50 on eBay, and I believe that G0CAG has one of those. That's a 2-band antenna, and that can be quite a useful antenna for working satellites as well. And that's quite a nice starter antenna, and something useful even when you perhaps go on to something larger and more exquisite, that can still be useful to throw in the back of the car, take on holiday, or indeed to use to work satellites. What I did want to talk about, though, was what you might build yourself, because there's lots of opportunities with VHF and antennas above to build your own. Lots of information on the website, but I've chosen a couple, and I think this these are great ideas for club projects. I mean, most of the materials required for these antennas can be obtained from B&Q. You can see that M0ICR there has built his own 6-element Yagi with bits of wood and aluminium tubing. And then on the right hand side you can see the dimensions for that. That'll be a fairly good starter antenna. You can see it's got about 9 dB of gain, looking at the information on the top right hand side, and so it's quite similar to the one I was talking about earlier when I was talking about beam widths, and all of the dimensions there that you would need to build that are there. But quite a fun club project to build once we're all allowed to meet up again. And then there's a link there to that antenna should you wish to go and have a look at it. And here's some other things that you can do, and there's lots of other ideas as well, but these are antennas made out of tape measures. Now, the one on the left hand side is dual band. That can be used for satellite use, and the one on the right hand side is just a single band antenna for 2 meters, where the elements are made out of a combination of plumbing intersections, hose clips, and tape measure elements, and that kind of thing could easily be built in a single club night by a number of group members if you've bought the bits and pieces from B&Q in advance. And of course, once you've done that, you may even wish then to do a fox hunt or something similar, but I won't talk about fox hunts in detail here. So I think there's some great ideas for club projects for you to build antennas within Harrow. I'm going to talk a little bit about WebSDR, because SDR is an opportunity for you to listen to what's happening on VHF and UHF, perhaps if you don't have a radio, or perhaps if you're just away from home and you want to have a listen around the country. But it's also something really useful to test your own transmitter. So if you are testing your want to test your transmissions, the quality of your audio, for example, then you can tune in on a local SDR receiver through WebSDR, and some links there on the right hand side for 3 in the UK and 1 in the Netherlands, and then a full list at the bottom for you to have a listen to your own transmitted signal. And of course, if you are able to rotate your antenna, then you're able to also see the effect of that beam as you move away from pointing at that SDR receiver and then back towards it, and you'll see your signal increase. And actually, you can see very quickly, get an indication of what your beam width might be like just by using SDR. It's also a good opportunity, perhaps during a contest, before you want to dip your toe, or to just listen to some of the DX and weak stations and beacons, perhaps, and a bit more on beacons later, than just by simply using your computer and the internet. So if you're interested in any of this, I'd strongly advise to have a little play with SDR, to have a listen, and also to help you in setting up your own station. So I'm going to talk a bit about location, and I think it's true to say that location is important, but it shouldn't put you off. There are people that say, well, I live in the bottom of a valley, so there's no point in me doing VHF because nobody will hear me. Well, I would say simply give it a go, because you might be surprised how well you can do. There's no doubt that if you are on ground that has a clear line of sight all around you, and perhaps slightly elevated from the local area where you can get an antenna high enough that it's not pointing at trees or buildings, you'll probably do better. Similarly, if you're working your amateur radio station from home and you have a lot of domestic noise from televisions and LED lights and so on, then either raising your antenna, dealing with some of that domestic noise may help. But no, or very few locations are entirely useless. And I would simply say, give it a go and see what you can do. And if you really struggle from home, then consider getting out portable and operating from a better site away from home. And here's a couple of examples. This is M0ICR, James operating from his back garden. You see he's got a pretty good hill there on the back garden, and you can see the contester's folding chair, his antennas. That's a 9-element tonner. I can tell that immediately because the boom is a bit droopy, and I think he's just rotating that by hand in any one direction. Of course, that's the sort of thing that doesn't need to be permanent, doesn't need to be an eyesore that will upset the neighbours or upset other members of the house, but can be set up and taken down in just half an hour to do a bit of DXing or contesting and then taken down at the end. Here's an example on the right hand side of G0CAG, David, out with one of those oldie but goldie radios. That's an ICOM 451. He's got it there, and I think in a Sainsbury's carrier bag, and he's at North Haller Fields, and I think he was just operating, I think with that diamond antenna that I showed before, that dual bander, and operating from a mount. He's just walked up the hill with that, and he's operating in a contest. And David may want to talk about more of that later. Here's some of my own examples. This is me out on 23 centimeters, 10 watts, up near Lacey Green and the Chilterns, and you can see there I've just got my mast strapped to a gate post. I'm going to be operating from the back of the car. The antenna doesn't need to be too high there because I'm already on some really high ground with a good line of sight all around me. And in that particular contest, that map on the right, those blue drops show the stations that I worked on that particular day. You can just about see in North London a red dot. That's where I am, and you can see on that night from that location on 23 centimeters with just 10 watts, I was working all the way up into Northumbria, and all the way into the Netherlands, and then down in towards Devon and across into Wales and the Isle of Man. And this is me again near Bude, this time on 2 meters on the left hand side. That's an antenna, very similar size to the 6 elements I was talking about before, and you can see I've got a drive-on plate there with that's a pretty cheap and cheerful Moonraker mast, and I'm going to be operating out of the back of the car. You can see the photograph on the right, that's an 857. My folding chair, you can just see by the left wheel arch the contester's flask of tea, and that's me getting ready for a 2 meter contest, and I'll be turning that antenna, that mast, I'll be turning that by hand in the direction that I want it to point. And again, this is me out. This is again up at the Chilterns. That's with an FT991. I see I've set up a small picnic table, and there's the antenna. This is a 6 meter beam, again on a drive-on plate at the side of the car. So all fairly straightforward, intermediate and beginner stuff that you can do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about location now, and the first thing I want to talk about is locators, and hopefully everyone can see that map, which is green and blue. The green, of course, is the shape of Northern Europe, UK and Ireland, and you can see that it's divided up into a series of squares. And if you are going to start getting an interest in VHF, DXing and contesting, one of the first things for you to know is what your locator is. It's quite important because this is what people will use to describe the location, and these locators are used to distinguish for what we call multipliers, and I'll talk about multipliers later. But by working stations in other squares, then you can gain additional points by the number of squares that you'll work. If you want to work out where your locator is, then you can use that link that's on the right hand side, or you can just type in amateur radio locator, and there are a number of tools online where you'll be able to zoom in and to pinpoint to your house or your garden, and that will give you a 6-figure number. And so and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. So moving on then to just talk about knowing your locator. Well, here's a map which is centered on Harrow. I thought that would be appropriate given this is Radio Society of Harrow, and you can probably see some thin grey lines there which break up into 6-figure grid references, 6-figure locators, the local area. To make that easier, I've overlaid that now with a red matrix, and you can see each of those locators, which are 6-figure locators. And there we go, that's what those locators are known as. So if you're operating in Northolt, you're probably in IO 91 Tango November. If you are in Edgware, you're probably in IO 91 Uniform Oscar. But you need to check because that locator will become important later in order to work out where other stations are. And to let them know where you are. And as I said, the links that I've shown before will help you with that. But that map may also help you if you happen to be within one of those squares. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about logging stations, and I think this applies equally whether we're talking about contesting or DXing. Of course, paper logs can be used. There's an example of a paper log. I'm sure you've all seen those. But the tool of choice, certainly for VHF contesting, is Minos, and I'll talk a bit more about the Minos logging software in a second. But there are other options. But our recommendation would be Minos, and I will talk about that a little more in a second. So what I want to talk about now, with that as a background, having covered a little bit about location, having reassured you that it's worth having a go from anywhere, there's a wide range of radios that will be suitable, but what you're really looking for is upper sideband capability on 2 meters and above, or of course 4 meters and 6 meters, which many radios will have. So you're looking for upper sideband. I've spoken about antennas, what you can achieve with vertical antennas, and why beams are preferable, and what kind of beam that you might want to have a look at, and that you might want to consider building your own beam. And we've spoken about locators. So let's now move on to talk about a contest. And I want to talk about the UK activity contest. And the reason I want to talk about the UK activity contest is it's a really good contest to get started in. It runs regularly. It's only short. It runs most Tuesdays and Thursday nights. Not quite, and I'll explain why and where to find out when they run. I'll talk about how they're run, and I'll talk a little bit in a second about the FM activity contest as well. So each Tuesday and Thursday evening, with some exceptions, there's an opportunity for a couple of hours, 2.5 hours, to work some DX using the UK activity contest to workstations who are all trying to score points in order to develop their stations, understand how their stations are improving over time, and for many of us to see where we appear on what is essentially a squash ladder of points which accumulate over successive months. What makes this a doubly fun contest to enter is that you're able to submit your points into a club or into a contest group. And by doing so, not only are you able to accumulate your own points over months, but you're contributing to a club's scores. And of course, it's then competitive and it's fun to see how those clubs are then competing against each other and their members compete against each other week on week. Now those contests are generally conducted with almost all QSOs happening on upper sideband. There may be a few CW QSOs, and some of the more advanced stations may use some of the more exquisite digital modes as well, not FT8 in most cases, certainly not for UKAC, but also sometimes on the same night, an hour before, is an FM version of that. So even if you don't have a USB radio, then there's an opportunity with your FM radio to do an hour's contesting before the UKAC starts on some weeks. And we'll talk about how to find out when they're on and how they run in the next slides. So the first website that the next website that I really want to introduce you to is this one. This is the website of the RSGB VHF Contesting Committee. And this really, if you're interested in getting involved in VHF contesting in the UK, is generally the first place to look. You'll see on this, and there's the link to that on the right hand side. I'm not going to go through this in detail. One of the best ways will be just to go to the link and just navigate your way around and see how it works. But I am going to highlight a couple of things. You'll see on the toolbar across the top, there's the VHF calendar. That's what I've highlighted here. And you'll see 4 contests in this month. It highlights, so from the 2nd of March through to the 9th of March, the contests that happened in the week that I put this presentation together. And you can see that, for example, on Tuesday, the 2nd of March, there was a 144 megahertz or 2 meters UKAC, UK activity contest that ran from 2000 hours to 22:30. And indeed, if you clicked on that link, the name of the contest, it would take you to more information about it. And indeed, to save you and to illustrate, I've done that now, and you can see that if you clicked on that, that would take you to this page, which would then list when those contests are on, the date, and the time. And what you can see is that the 2 meter contests tend to be, in fact they are, on the first Tuesday of the month. So all of those dates represent the first Tuesday of the month. And so those of us that enjoy UKAC, make a mental note or a post-it note that the first Tuesday of every month is 2 meter UKAC. And of course, there are more details on there about the contest that you can read into in terms of power levels and categories that you can enter. It's important to remain within the band plan. And again, through the RSGB site, there'll be links to that. But as an example, and this is a cut and paste from the RSGB band plan, and there's a web link there to take you to that PDF band plan for 2021. But you would see that on 2 meters, as I show on the right-hand side, that for upper sideband, that whilst there are a couple of other bits of the band that you can use, for the main part, it's going to be 144 to 144 150 to 144 400. And just as a pointer now, you'll see within the rules that you're generally asked to avoid calling frequencies or centers of activity, but you'll find that information in the rules. So I spoke about those locators earlier. Why are they important? Well, for the UKAC, your score will be the total number of kilometers of the stations that you work, and don't worry, the logging program works this out for you. And then there's a bonus that comes from 500 points times the number of 4-figure locators. So let's say I work 20 stations in the contest, and that totals 2,000 kilometers. So they averaged 100 kilometers each. I worked 20 of them, and that gives me 2,000 kilometers total. But I worked them in 5 different squares. So for those 5 different squares, I get 500 times 5. I worked 5 different 4-letter squares, and so I get 500 times 5 as a bonus. And so my total score is then the 2,000 plus 2,500. So it's a total score of 4,500. If that's complicated, it won't be once you've done it for the first time, and it's all explained on the RSGB website. But what it does mean is that the imperative is to work as many of those squares as you can, not just the maximum number of people. Ideally, what you want to do is to work the maximum number of people and the maximum number of squares. So these squares are known as multipliers for obvious reasons, because they multiply the score. But the key is to try and work as many of those squares as you can and as many people, so that these things then add up and multiply up into a larger score. And then they're normalized so that you get your position on the squash ladder. And of course, there's a real strategy in this, because do you spend 45 minutes trying to work a square that's quite rare? Do I try and for 30 minutes try and work somebody in Inverness? Or would it be more productive for me to work people 50 kilometers away? Well, you have to, it's a combination of the strategy and the tactics that you want to use in that contest, what conditions are like, and how you think you might go about maximizing your score. So let's look now at the context exchange for a UKAC contest. So let's suppose that you've decided that you want to enter the 2-meter contest. You've discovered that your radio already has 2 meters USB. You have understood where in the band plan that you can operate, and you've got the right day of the week. And maybe for the month or 2 previously, you haven't taken part. Maybe you've had a listen. It's not necessary, but maybe you've chosen to do that. And now you're ready for your first UKAC contest. So what information is required in the exchange? Well, again, all of this information is on the RSGB website. But essentially, there are 4 things that you need to send. The first is the call sign of the station you're working, his signal report, his serial number, and your locator. Now, the serial number is a consecutive number that starts at 001, number 1, and works upwards, adding 1 for each person that you work. So the first person I work in the contest will be 001, and then clearly the 7th is 7, 007, and the 20th is 020 or 20. Signal reports on VHF contests, people tend to be accurate. And I think this is again one of the differences in VHF contest, HF contesting, where it's always 5 and 9. But actually in VHF, it's helpful to get accurate signal reports, because it gives you an idea about how difficult finishing that QSO might be, and gives you an indication of how well your station's working as well. It's useful to give accurate signal reports, not just 5 and 9. Give a consecutive increasing number and your locator square that, of course, you've worked out from the links that I gave earlier. And please, if you're starting, try and get them in the right order. If you need to, write down that order. Again, you can find reference back to this on the RSGB website, but that would then allow you to complete a context exchange. So if a station is calling CQ contest, I might reply with my call sign, M0ICR. That station, let's say they're Golf 3 Romeo Alpha Tango, will say, Golf 3 Romeo Alpha Tango, you're 59001 in Italy Oscar 91 Alpha Bravo. I would reply, if he was my first serial and he was 5 and 9, I would reply, Golf 3 Golf 3 Romeo Alpha Tango, Roger, you're also 59, serial 001, and then my home square, Italy Oscar 91 Sierra Oscar. The best way to grasp that if you're new is have a listen to a contest and get an idea for the cadence, or even just have a listen for the first 5 or 10 minutes of a contest, get the cadence and then jump in. Don't worry, people will be patient with you, and we're always welcome and willing to hear new people on the band. Give it a go. This is Minos, the logging program I mentioned. I'm not going to cover that here. There are some video tutorials. Of course, you can start off with paper logging as you like. Most people for VHF will use Minos. There's a copy of me using Minos. There's the link on the right-hand side. I'm not going to cover it in a great deal of detail, but I would be happy to cover it subsequently in other talks, or if you want to follow up with me. Entering your log, just follow the rules, and it's all there on the RSGB website about how to upload your log in the correct format. And there are some more guidance on that RSGB page, which I linked previously, about uploading your log from Minos. Uploading your log takes you to an entry page where just through drop downs you can enter your log. Now, my first plug for the Drowned Rats is that if you're not a member of a club, then we would be delighted for you to take part and to join the Drowned Rats. You'd be very welcome. Of course, you might want to contest for another club. You might even want to do something within Harrow. Although, there are good reasons why you might want to consider the Drowned Rats, and I'll come on to some more of that later. But you can select there from the drop downs, enter the club, and then just follow the instructions in how to enter your log. When you've entered your log, then you'll see the squash ladders start to appear. I won't go through these in details, but you can see as an example there from the RSGB website how stations have posted how well they did in the contest. And then on the right hand side you can see that squash ladder I referred to, where all the accumulated points from groups which have been normalized are added up, and that's a league table that shows us in that case 5th on that general club score league table as the Drowned Rats. So a little bit more on UKAC. The first thing, well, as I said so many times, it's easy to get started, honestly. Listening is a good way to dip your toe, to get an idea of the cadence. You don't have to do the whole contest. If 2.5 hours is too much, you can do 10 minutes, you can do 20 minutes, just do an hour and switch off and then go and have a cup of coffee. Or you can do the whole thing if the bug's bitten. It's quite fun to set yourself some of your own realistic goals. If the first time you came on, you didn't work anybody outside of your own square in IO 91, but the next time you go on, you work somebody a little bit further away, let's say in Leicester in IO 92, then that's starting to show some progress. And if that progress has come because you've learned a bit more, or you've built a new antenna, or you've put your antenna at a different location, or you've got your antenna a bit higher, then you can start to see how by improving your station, you can start to work more people, work further distances, and start to work some real DX. And with a little bit of perseverance, with a fairly moderate station and with limited investment, then certainly on bands like 2 meters and 70 centimeters, it's entirely feasible from a suburban plot running 100 watts and even 10 watts with a fairly short beam antenna to work into Northern Europe, or to be working into Northern Ireland or into Scotland from a location in and around Harrow. And certainly that's my personal experience, and those of a number of others like David G0CAG and Damien G4LHT, who are both drowned rats and also members of Radio Society of Harrow. Read the rules and read the band plan and avoid the calling frequencies. And if you're not sure, then just ask. Consider joining a group that is a special interest group that is particularly interested in VHF and contesting. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to talk about the rats, welcoming all members of our Radio Society of Harrow. And indeed, many of our members are also members of Radio Society of Harrow. I'd say we've got a close friendship and relationship with the Radio Society of Harrow. And so there are lots of good reasons why, if you wanted to dip your toe into VHF DXing and VHF contesting, you might consider the rats as your natural home for that. So a little bit more about DXing then, and where some of those skills that I've mentioned earlier, and some of that equipment, and some of what you may be learning through doing something like UKAC can also be used outside contests. And there's a couple of aspects that are fun within VHF and above that I'm going to mention, and a couple of websites that you might wish to have a further look at. So one thing that's quite good fun is beacons, and you can go to the beacon website. Sorry, I haven't put the link there, but easy to find through a Google search, and you can look at where beacons are. These are the ones just for 2 meters and 70 centimeters in the UK. But of course, you can test your receiver. You can test whether your receiver antenna is working well. You can and you can also test techniques like air scatter, and I am going to cover that in a second as well. But listening to beacons is a really good way to test how well your antenna is working, and to play with some of the, for example, filtering features on your radio, your attenuator and your RF gain, and even when there's nobody else on the band, to get a good feel for improving your radio. And indeed, just before a contest, what many contesters will do to get a feel for what conditions might be like on a given day is have a tune round and point their antenna at some of these beacons on the designated frequency, which on this web page you would be able to find just by clicking on the red teardrop. It would give you the frequency for that beacon, and if you could hear that beacon, then you'd have a pretty good idea that conditions are fair in that direction. I'm going to talk a little bit about air scatter, not least because I know some members of our group do enjoy using it, and it was something I just didn't believe was even possible when it was first introduced to me. But one way you can extend the range of your station is by bouncing your signals off aircraft, as strange as that sounds. And for many years, people did that, but it was largely by trial and error and fluke. But smart Alex these days have now designed software that takes feeds from open source aircraft traffic databases in live real time, and then can determine, based on elevation data and then distance between 2 stations, the height of the aircraft and the position of the aircraft, whether there will be a possibility that you can use that aircraft as a mirror in the sky, and for a limited part of the aircraft's flight path, you'll be able to essentially use it as a reflector in the sky. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like then, this is the same map we showed earlier. That's my rather poor example of the emissions coming off my 6-element Yagi on let's say 2 meters. I'm in the red triangle, and you can see that station 9, I'm just not working, and is too far away. But I'm looking at some software to try and work out whether, if an aircraft did appear, whether actually I might be able to use it as a reflector. So there we have an aircraft on that flight path indicated by the green line, and I can now use some software that allows me to predict, which is shown as a pink line, that there is a part of that flight path on the expected flight path of that aircraft, knowing where I am and the other station is, that pink line underneath the aircraft, that for that part of the flight path, then there's a pretty good chance that my signals will bounce off the aircraft and be received by the aircraft at position 9, and vice versa. Now, of course, the aircraft's fast moving, and so the opportunity to do that may be fleeting. It may only be minutes, and in some cases could even be seconds. But a lot of people use it to great effect. I know Damien LHT has recently started using air scatter to great effect, and M0ICR, another drowned rat, uses air scatter considerably, and he's able to extend his range often quite far into Europe by bouncing off aircraft. So let's look at how that might happen. Well, the key software we use is called Air Scout. There's a link to that on the bottom right hand corner. What you can see on the left hand side is a map, is a screenshot of Air Scout working. And I'll just illustrate a couple of things on this. So this is me trying to look at the path between myself just in northwest London. That is, you can see the red teardrop on the map. And if you look towards Northern Ireland, that's Mark, EI3KD, there in just to the north east of Cork. And that's a fair old distance. That's over 500 kilometers. And I'm struggling to make that link. But what Air Scout is showing me, and it's the first of the big red circles that I've drawn on top of this, is that there are aircraft coming on to the path of that that link between us, where I may be able to get communication between us by using it as a giant reflector. And the map, what the chart below shows, with the red circle, you'll see a little green dot there. Now, when that little green dot moves from left to right into the pink shaded zone that you can see in the intersectors of the yellow and red lines, then that's the hot zone. That's the time that I'm going to be able to call EI3KD and use the aircraft to bounce off. So I'm not going to go through all the details about how to use air scatter, but I just want to whet your appetite into the kind of things you can do in VHF DXing that are great fun, and there's some software out there that can really enhance that. There's a link here which is worth having a look at on YouTube, and you can get an idea of how that works in a QSO. This is on 23 centimeters between G3XDI there in Norfolk out to DL0 Golf Tango Hotel, quite deep into Germany, and he's using air scatter to do that. And if you listen or watch the YouTube link there, that gives you a really good example of that. And remember, as I said before, that if you want to see the PowerPoint version of this, then you can link to it through my blog that I mentioned earlier, rather than watch on YouTube, where you won't be able to directly access those links. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is Hepburn, and I've seen Paul and others talking about Hepburn. So Hepburn is really the weather forecast for DXing on VHF bands, and this gives us an indication of what the VHF conditions might be like in order to get the most out of tropospheric propagation. Now, I'm not going to go into details about what that is, but suffice to say that when there's a tropospheric cloud, those bright blotches over your location and the station that you're intending to work, then you have a significantly enhanced chance of working them. So the map on the left, which you can see I copied only on the 9th of March, was pretty poor. We would say the Hepburn's not looking great, not much tropo at the moment, and only a couple of isolated purple splodges there around the Netherlands and a little bit off the coast of southwest Wales. But look at what we had on Wednesday, the 3rd of March. And isn't it inevitable to see that Tuesday, the map of the 9th was on Tuesday when there's a contest on. The map on the right is a Wednesday when there isn't a contest on, and look at the conditions there. And that's actually rather good enhanced propagation conditions. So all things being equal, on the assumption that I am within where those tropospheric clouds are shown on these maps, I'm going to do better when the conditions are like they are on the right hand side, than they are on the left-hand side of the slide. If you want to link to these slides and you want to follow the propagation charts, and they're produced a few days in advance, and you can also look at an archive of them, but you can predict what conditions will be like by clicking on the link again, or making a note of the link above those two maps. So those are the Hepburn maps, the Tropo maps that people might talk about, and Tropo forecasting. I'm coming to the end of the main part of this presentation. This is another useful VHF site. This is called Make More Miles on VHF. It's actually a German site. This is a great place to look for, again, indications of propagation enhancements, and also sporadic E. I'd love to talk to you about sporadic E tonight, but there won't be time. Perhaps that's a subject for another talk. But I would certainly, if you're interested in VHF propagation and conditions and prediction and forecasting, then I'd recommend this site as a really useful dashboard for what's going on the VHF bands and higher. And that concludes the first three parts of the presentation. What I wanted to indulge in now, just for the next 5 or 10 minutes, was to talk a little bit about the rats and what we are and why we do this, and just to show you a few photographs of us doing some VHF stuff. So we're a local group, beginner friendly. We love to train newcomers, but we equally welcome old hands. And I'm very aware that within Radio Society of Harrow, there are some who are retired, or one might say reformed contesters. There are some that have never done it before, but we have a broad cross-section within our own group, and we welcome people with no knowledge, or those that have decades of knowledge. A few photographs there of us out contesting, both in tents and also in a cottage in Kent for one particular contest. So what we really wanted to say was that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the group in a minute, but we normally have a small joining fee which covers our costs, but we really would like to offer you any member of Radio Society of Harrow that would like to join us for 2021 and have a look at what we do, and to see perhaps come out on a contest with us, and to take part in UKACs and some other benefits that I'll mention in a minute. Then we'd like to offer you a half-price membership for 2021, and that would be valid until the end of March. So for the cost of 3 beers, you'd be very welcome to join us. And a little bit more on that in a second as I talk about VHF contesting and DXing. There's Ratty on the left-hand side. He's our club mascot. He's sitting on top of one of those DB6 NT Kuna transverters. That's a boxed-up version, and that was just down in Kent on a contest. At the right-hand side, again, shows Ratty, the team mascot, and there's Richard G8FUO and Anthony G7LRQ in the operating tent. I think that was a couple of years ago in one of the summer contests. Those are the kinds of antenna setups that we put up when we go out on weekend contests. The larger picture, the left-hand slide, is Walbury Hill, and the moving from the left to the right-hand side. The smaller antennas are single beam antennas that we're using for 4 and 6 meters, which and then we see in the third antenna from the left is a stack of 4 70-centimeter antennas, and then on the right-hand side a stack of 4 2-meter antennas, and that was ours, I believe, on field day about 3 or 4 years ago. On the right-hand side, there's another example of the stack of 4 2-meter antennas. That was a different contest, but you can get a feel for the size of the kind of engineering that we're putting up for some of the bigger contests. I'll come back to the show reel in a second and ask Kirk to play that. But in that contest that I was talking about, the March contest in 2020, so this contest took place just a week before things went into lockdown. The map on the left-hand side shows you what we were working into Europe. And that wasn't a particularly busy contest. There weren't The weather hadn't been great. There weren't as many stations on as there might normally be, for example, in National Field Day. But you can see that the majority of stations and the majority of the time we were beaming towards Germany. And you can see that we're working right out there into the Czech border, into Switzerland, into France. And in many contests, we might expect to work into Spain as well. But certainly the range in that contest for us, I think our furthest contest was something like 950 kilometers. And then on the right hand side, that was our map for 432 megahertz for 70 centimeters. And again, not much difference, about 900 kilometers range. And you can see the spread of contacts that we were making with that particular contest station. The result of that was that Drowned Rats won, and that's the certificate for the March 144432 2020 contest. So reasons to join the Rats? Well, we're an RSGB affiliated society, one of the UK's top contesting groups. If you look at the tables over the years, we are for the big weekend contests generally up there in the top 3, 4, 5, and sometimes at the very top and win, but certainly competitive near the top. We are a local group, and we have a great number of members of Radio Society of Harrow within the group. Myself, David WCB, Damon G4LHT, and many others, G0CAG. So a close affinity to Radio Society of Harrow. I've said already, we're beginner and accessible. We have a forum of our own, not Facebook, nothing like that. It's our own little corner of social media where we have lots of chats and advice called Mattermost, and basically gives you on-tap advice from, in some cases, people who are experts, or at least people who've tried and made the same mistakes themselves, and will be more than happy to help. Our age range is from 30 to 70 plus, and we have M6s, M7s, and a fair number of very experienced G3s as well. We're small enough for everyone to count and have a voice. We do a lot more than contesting, and we also do HF, but some of the members don't come out on weekends and do that kind of stuff. Some of the people just do UKACs, and others are much more interested in the technical side, and there's a very big sort of construction and technical element to what we do as well. We do weekly events, mostly centered around the UKAC, but there's no compunction to do that. You can do as much or as little as you like. Clearly, we'd like you to do as much as you can, but there is no pressure to do more than you're happy with. We have a loan store of equipment. So remember before I was talking about radios and antennas and so on. If you don't have those, but you want to join the Drowned Rats, we have all that equipment to loan new members on a short-term basis until you sort yourself out. I've mentioned the Lively Information Hub. And when we go back to being able to live our lives normally after COVID, then we'll return to monthly pub meetings, which are not too far from Harrow in Harefield. We have a number of members who don't live in the area, number of expats that did live in Harrow but have moved away. But we keep in touch through online meetings. We have webinars, quizzes, and lots of other stuff. And of course, as I think I've already shown you, and we're about to show you with the slide reel, we have a top class, well-equipped contest stations if you do want to get involved in weekends away. And we're delighted to be able to offer you that at a half price. There's a show reel, which we'd just like to show you with a number of photographs that show VHF contesting, I think, in a good light, and show the fun that we have as the Rats. So, Kirk, can I ask you to play the
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. We'll have a link to the presentation if you're watching on demand later on. We'll have a link to the presentation in the description. I'm fascinated by air scatter. Frankly, I think it sounds crazy. I'm sure it's very sensible, but it sounds like the sort of thing that people would only come up with. You know, it's one of those things that could never have existed before computers were involved with it, and you could find out where all the planes were, right?
Yeah.
I will start off with questions. If anybody has any more questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll ask them to Carl. Don, if you need me to go back to your presentation, just let me know, Carl, and I can go back to that.
Yeah. Could you go back to the last slide, please?
Yeah.
The very last one, the one that I'm now showing, because that's got the links at the very end.
Yeah.
Just so whilst we're talking, if people want to make a note of the links for the special offer and to our website, then they'll be up on the screen whilst we're talking.
I think Damien pointed out that 4 ex-presidents of Radio Society of Harrow are Drown Rat members. So Donald Lamb was asking where the cloverleaf antenna right at the beginning was available. I think you said, but I'm not quite sure we caught it.
So I think they're available in a number of places, but the one that most people tend to use is a German supplier called Vimo, which is www.whiskeyindiamikeoscar.de. Vimo or Wimo, but you can make them yourself fairly easily with a pipe bender and aluminium tubing. But I believe the one I showed a picture of is from Vimo. I think Peter is in the chat. Maybe Peter can tell us where he got his from, but I'm pretty sure that Peter's got a 3-element big wheel or cloverleaf. Cool.
Thank you. While we're on that topic, Martin G4GRS said, do you have an experience of stacked cloverleaf or big wheel antennas?
Oh, not personally, but yes, they work, and there's a number of people on the internet that have had good experience with them, and also stacking halos. And I know that at least one person who's joined this group and in the chat has had real success from a good location, stacking a couple of halos on 2 meters, because what they lack in gain, they gain in the all-round omnidirectional effect that they create. So you don't need to turn them. And if you're working because one of the things in a short contest, one of the real disadvantages can be that your beam is so narrow that you're pointing in one direction and nobody else can hear you, and there isn't the time for them all to work them all. But if you're working omnidirectional, then everybody's hearing you all of the time, and that can be a real advantage. So yeah, absolutely, you can stack a big wheel, you can stack halos, you can stack just about anything, but it's important to get the spacing right. And again, you can find information on that on the internet, and you'll need a harness to connect them together. But if you've got the splitter and you've got the spacing right, then absolutely yes, you can.
Okay. Hamza asked, what are your thoughts about the Arrow Yagi antenna? I primarily operate portable from a backpack, so it seems appealing.
Yeah, the Arrow's designed for satellite use, of course, and the 70 centimeter and 2 meter elements are out of phase, or cross-polarized more accurately. That being said, if you want to use it on one band, it's still a 2-element Yagi, and I think there's a 4 and a 5-element version. I think there's a slightly longer and a shorter version of an Arrow. So yeah, it would work, and it would work as well as most other antennas with the same number of elements. So yeah, you certainly don't need an Arrow and a cross-polarized antenna, but yes, it will work.
Okay. Thank you. And one last question from me. I don't see any more coming in the chat at the moment. You said that the contest scores are normalized for relative position. I just wasn't quite sure what that meant.
Okay. So they, and it's actually it's quite interesting. So when the scores are put into a there's quite a complex formula. When they're put into the overall list, the number of points that you score is converted into a positional number, so that it's not the actual score. The number that you get is based on your position. So the score that you get is based on your position, and that's done through normalization. So basically what they do is let me try and get this formula right, but I'm not even going to try and remember the formula. But it's a relative score rather than an absolute score. So they're normalized so that they can create a fair spread. And what's interesting in that is you find that moderate stations can actually do rather well, particularly if they group up and join a club and join a team, because what normalization does is actually brings the range of scores closer together. So the highest possible that you can actually score, the top person in any contest will score 1,000 points. No matter how much better he does than anybody else, or she, he can only score an HPS of 1,000. Well, to be a fairly moderate station, and from a suboptimal suburban location, without the latest and most huge antenna, it's fairly easy, he says, but generally fairly easy to be scoring somewhere in the order of, say, 400 points. So you can see that 3 beginners can score more points than the best contester in the country. And so groups that attract lots of newcomers can actually take on the big boys if what they attract is lots of beginners. And that's why we've been so keen to bring in lots of beginners, not just because we actually enjoy training people, but also because as a team, every little really does count. Every little does help. And so normalized scores reduce the spread and ensure that those that are at the very top are limited by an HPS.
Okay, cool. So it's a bit like exam scores when they get sort of flattened out as well.
Yeah, they're just flattened out. And flattening out means that those who are in the middle and at the bottom can still actually do quite well. Okay.
Thanks again, Carl.
No, nobody's asked me why we called the drowned rats. I was so disappointed. It's a question we're always asked. But I'm not going to answer it because nobody's answered it. So I'll leave that as an enigma. I'll leave it as an enigma. We were scheduled for 2 hours. There's 10 minutes left. Are there really no more questions? Because I'm really happy if somebody's got something burning that they would like to ask but haven't thought of yet.
I did notice in your in one of the lists of, you showed a list of teams in a contest. There was another one which had a very similar name to Drowned Rats as well. It seemed like a bit of a...
Was that Leicestershire Foxes?
I think it was another one as well that seemed a bit...
Black Sheep?
Possibly, I can't remember now. But it did seem to be a sort of thing of weird animal-based names.
Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I mean, I mean, our name simply comes from the fact that the first time we went out testing some gear, even before we'd done our first contest, we just all got absolutely drenched in the field. And we were thinking of all kinds of grand names. We were going to call ourselves the Middlesex this or the Hertfordshire that, and actually somebody just said we look like a load of drowned rats, and that was it. It stuck.
Chris has asked it now, just so you know. Chris Field has asked why you're called the Drowned Rats, so you know.
So we're called the Drowned Rats because about 5 or 6 years ago, when we started, Dave M0ICR, Anthony G7LRQ, and David GALZE, and myself were on a playing field near Rickmansworth, trying to work out how to put an antenna together before we went on our first contest. And we were in the middle of the field with a box of tools and lots of aluminium. And I think it was in the summer. We were all there in t-shirts and shorts, and there was a freak storm, and we all got drenched. And that's why we're the Drowned Rats.
Thank you again, Carl. I'm gonna wrap up now, if that's all right with you.
Of course.
I'm gonna go through a menu and then we'll go on from there. So thank you very much again. I would clap, but there's only me here, so it'd be rather bad, rather lame sounding, really. But I'm sure everyone is giving you a lot of praise on the chat. So thank you very much again.
Thank you all for listening. And whether you are interested in joining us, you want to go your own way, you want to, whatever you want to do, if you want advice, please just drop me an email or ask any one of our group members, and we'd be more than happy to help you on your way and give you advice. So don't be a stranger. Look us up, and we're always open to join us. Thank you everybody for listening. Have a great weekend, and look forward to meeting you all once the COVID restrictions are removed. Good night, all.
Thank you. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up, we have the annual general meeting in a couple of weeks' time. There's a Zoom link for that. Mike will email you at some point in the next couple of weeks, so you can join that. And Mike, M0ICR will indeed be giving a talk at some point in the future when we can get back to the Computer History Museum, I think. I forget the names. They're all very similar. About how the Turing bomb broke Enigma. So that will probably be fun. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along tonight. Thanks again to Carl, and we'll see you all soon.